Hello and welcome to our second webinar of the day, leveraging Red Hat OpenShift for a multi-cloud strategy. This webinar is being presented by Miles Brown, Senior Cloud and DevOps Advisor with Exit Certified. During the webinar, Miles will be interviewing John about Red Hat OpenShift platform and how it can be used as a cornerstone for multi-cloud architecture. They will discuss options for getting started with OCP in AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. By attending this webinar, you will learn how Red Hat OpenShift platform can be used in various environments. You will learn how organizations are adopting a multi-cloud strategy and how OCP can aid in that. Finally, you will learn how to get started in OpenShift with Red Hat's robust learning and certification path. Stay tuned till the end of the webinar where we will announce an exciting promotion on upcoming Red Hat courses with Exit Certified. During the webinar, everyone's microphones will be muted, so if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you enjoy the presentation today and are interested in learning more about training anywhere with our interactive virtual platform called IMVP, please visit our website or contact us. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll send a copy to each and every one of you by the end of the week. All right, now let's get started. Take it away, Miles.
Thanks, Michelle. I'd like to first thank John for coming in today. He's a solutions architect in the training and certification division at Red Hat, and he knows a lot about OpenShift. And so that's what we're going to talk about. But before we get into OpenShift, here at Exit Certified, we do a lot of cloud training. We're partnered with Amazon and Google and Microsoft. So we've got, all of the major cloud platforms. We've got courses on AWS, on Azure, on GCP, as well as IBM and Oracle clouds. And one of the things that we've noticed over the last, say, 5 years of really doing a lot of cloud training is that customers are increasingly figuring out their best cloud strategies. Early on, say 5 years ago, I was teaching AWS classes. And back then, there was a lot of people just dipping their toes in and, trying some workloads out, maybe some, non-mission critical dev and test environments. But by now, a lot of people have a lot of workloads running in the cloud, but they also still have some on-prem infrastructure and they want to keep using that. So we're seeing hybrid cloud become a very popular thing. And one of the biggest changes I've seen in the last year or so is a lot of organizations saying we need to be multi-cloud. So not just, maybe that is a private cloud plus a public provider, but it might even be multiple public providers. And there was a pretty good survey from RightScale, and here you see some of the results of how many of these cloud users were working with multiple public providers or in a hybrid cloud environment. And so that introduces some interesting choices that you have to do to decide, should I make use of all of the bells and whistles from this particular public cloud provider? There's a bit of a trade-off where you get kind of, stuck in that with that one vendor. And then what if you don't, love all of that vendor's choices and you want to use, maybe just the data analytics part from a different provider, right? And so there's lots of good reasons to keep your options open. There's also good reasons to go with just one vendor. But people are trying to figure that out, and a lot of companies are doing that. One of the other things that we're seeing happening hand in hand with cloud is this big move towards containerized workloads. So the rise of Docker and many other, Docker's not alone in the container business. And so what we're seeing is that all of these cloud vendors are trying to figure out how to help you with containers and orchestration of containers, but then they each have their own way of doing it. And so the question becomes, well, what if I want to be cloud agnostic? How am I going to run these containerized workloads in a way that I can run them on my own on-prem environment or in a public cloud or even in multiple public clouds. And so if you're not all that familiar with the concept of containers, maybe we take it back and we start with just a quick, what are containers? And this is where I'm going to bring in John. And like I said, thank you, John, for coming. We're really, really happy you're here. Maybe just tell everybody a little bit about what containers and orchestration is all about.
Sure. So, depending on where you fall, job role wise, containers offer, something different for everybody, right? So on the infrastructure side, being able to ship lightweight packages that wrap all of their dependencies all up in one, provides something that's really attractive. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the evolution from your bare metal systems to virtual machines and then into containers in just a second. And then from an application standpoint, it really provides the ability to really move into towards that DevOps mindset, right? Of continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment. And so depending on who you ask, containers really have a broad appeal for their ability to easily package an application and then all of its dependencies, right? That's really at the core of what a container is. You can then ship multiple versions of an application across multiple containers, and it doesn't really matter what the underlying OS is. It doesn't matter what those libraries or what have you in that OS are, because all of the libraries that the application needs live inside of that container, fully contained, right? So I mentioned this just a second ago, but this really all just kind of stems as an evolution, right? So organizations traditionally have been deploying virtual machines using something like VMware. We have Red Hat virtualization for a lot of their application workloads. And so what does that mean? You have your hardware. On top of that, you have your OS, the kernel, what have you, and then the dependencies are all tied to that kernel. And so you have your applications running in these virtual machines, and they're using they're dependent on the libraries and what have you from the kernel side. Whereas on containers, all of that stuff is going to be bundled in with itself. And so that's something that RHEL has been doing, or I should say Red Hat has been doing for quite some time with the RHEL, and really containers have been a part of Linux for 20, 25 years, right? Yeah. This is not something that's brand new, but it's definitely something that so many of our customers are now shifting away from virtual machines, or at least to maybe not completely, but to an extent, they're moving a lot of their workloads into the cloud, and it's just a lot easier, a lot more lightweight to move those into containers away from virtual machines. And so here we sort of have just a breakdown, right, of the pros and cons between VMs and containers. And the big thing here is isolation. You have that shared kernel on the container side, but that's just containers out of the box, right? You talked about Docker, we talked about Kubernetes. Podman is a project that's sort of the spiritual successor from Docker that we've gotten on board with over the last 6 to 12 months. When we talk about just containers on their own, it's really easy to just stand up a container solution, but you talk about, orchestration as being a big key of that. That's not something that you're really going to get. A lot of customers that adopted containers early on are having to find these kind of makeshift solutions. A lot of it is going to be, home baked as far as the orchestration layer, right? And Kubernetes, I think, provides a lot of that out of box, and it's really easy to get up and running with that, but there's so much more that comes with that, right?
Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit about what are the types of orchestration pieces that we need to do.
Yeah. So let's kind of, I guess, break it down from the smallest point, and we can kind of build up to that, right? So, we talk about containers, that's the smallest compute unit, right? So really all that it is an application and the runtimes that are necessary to run that application. And so, you could use Docker right now. You could spin up a web application really, really easily and have multiple versions of that application running simultaneously across the same workloads. So what does a container come from? So they come from these container images, and there are registries out there. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but you could download from like Docker Hub or something like that a bunch of these images and deploy. They're essentially binaries, and they have the runtime as a part of that. And so you're creating these containers from these images. Sometimes you're creating them from source code as well, but at the basis you're creating them from these application binaries.
These image registries, there's both private and public ones.
Definitely.
Yeah, and so if somebody just wants to share something, you don't know whether or not you can trust it either. Right?
100%.
So you need to find a registry with some trusted ones, but you also need the ability to, privately store your own ones.
100%. Right? Yeah. And so, we have some solutions in that regard as well. Quay is a really big project that we've that we've really embraced as far as a private registry, something that is hosted for you. Docker Hub or the registry that Red Hat has are typically trusted solutions, although you never really can tell with upstream registries if what you're getting is going to be fully vetted. Maybe it's not necessarily going to be nefarious, but it may not necessarily be exactly what you're looking for. And so, working with, companies like Red Hat who have these private registries, or I should say public registries through a subscription, you understand that those are going to be vetted, that they're going to be enterprise ready, right? And so, you have images, they're stored in a registry, whether they're public or private or some kind of combination of those, and you can deploy them straight from a registry. So, with Docker, for instance, you can run a really simple command to essentially pull down an image and spin that up into a container in just one command, right? And so you can essentially plug in Docker into Red Hat's registry, into Docker Hub, into GitLab or GitHub, something like that. There's millions of these registries, or I should say, images out there across multiple registries. And so, once you have a registry, think of a registry sort of like a repository, right? And really that is what they are. And so that's where things like version control come into play. You can essentially commit multiple versions of a single container image to these registries, and then you can pull down specific container images or specific versions of each of these container images. And so, what does that really mean? How is that really helpful? A lot of the times you're going to have customers who need to access specific versions of a specific application, right? And so what this means is that you can spin up all these containers across different versions in tandem. They're so lightweight that it really doesn't matter that you might have thousands of these up and running all at the same time. And then, OpenShift, which we'll talk about in a little bit, part of that orchestration layer is that, we have scalability, right? We can automate a lot of these things so that, if you're getting a lot of hits on a specific version of an application, you can scale those pods up, and we'll talk about what a pod is in just a second. But essentially, based on demand, you can scale up and scale down a lot of these containers, and being able to essentially have infrastructure as code or code as a service, if you want to call it that, makes it really easy to continuously deploy and integrate and iterate on all of these different applications as you're deploying them.
Okay, so the containers alone aren't enough to really run a robust application that's highly available and scalable. We're going to need some sort of orchestration, and you mentioned Kubernetes already. That seems to have become the de facto standard. There's other options out there, but that seems to be the one that everybody's interested in. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, so Kubernetes is essentially the heart of OpenShift, right? Our OpenShift product, and you'll see the same thing for a lot of those other container platforms out there. Amazon has theirs, VMware has theirs. Kubernetes serves as the basis for all of that. And what we're doing is we're essentially adding all of these other tools, this second layer on top of that orchestration layer, right? So things like storage and networking. We're able to build that all into a platform, into a UI that you can deploy that stuff all at the push of a button, right? Whether it's software-defined networking, whether it's integrated into various cloud vendors, like Miles said at the onset. The ability to essentially manage all of those containers within a centralized UI. Those containers can speak to each other. That's really where OpenShift comes into play. And OpenShift, unlike a lot of the other vendors out there, is completely vendor agnostic. And so it's something that can live on the bare metal. You can deploy it on your systems locally. So you have your on-prem container platform there, and it's something that can also be deployed onto all of the major vendors out there. So you can deploy really easily to AWS. You can deploy really easily to Azure. You can have it at home. Obviously we've just recently had a big piece of news, our acquisition with IBM, and IBM's vision is all around the hybrid cloud. And so that's something that essentially they picked us as their solution, because we were really the biggest name in hybrid cloud up until this point. And IBM obviously was really big on the cloud side, but they hadn't really gone headfirst into the hybrid cloud. And so, their vision for us strategically is to become the biggest hybrid cloud vendor out there, because we play well with everyone, right? A lot of people, they'll talk to me and they'll be like, isn't Amazon or VMware, aren't these like competitors of yours? And in some regards, probably, but in other regards, they are some of our biggest partners. They're people that we work with day in, day out to deploy these workloads. Most of the customers who are already adopting OpenShift are already Amazon customers, they're already VMware customers, they're Microsoft customers. They're deploying some workloads to Azure and some to AWS, some of that they're going to have on-prem, and they're using OpenShift with, say, OpenStack and tanned up for those solutions as well.
Nice. So if we take it back, we've got this container registry, we've got an image that we like. Where do we take it? What do we do with it?
Yeah, so essentially once deployed, let's just say we're not within OpenShift, right? Yeah. You deployed this, you need to associate some kind of storage with this container. Let's say it's a web server, something like that, some kind of networking so that the outside world can actually get into it. So what we would call this really is a pod. And a pod is essentially a group of containers with that shared storage and networking. And that's something that can be done outside of a container platform, but you need to have these kind of homebrew solutions to do all this stuff. And that's where a container platform really comes into play, because what we make really, really easy is the deployment piece, right? We can allow, essentially from a web UI, you can grab a container, a series of container images, deploy those into a pod. You can assign storage networking to it. You can secure it. You can monitor it. You can assign metrics to it as well. All of that within a central UI. And we're going to talk a little bit about this a little later on, but a lot of this can be automated now as well with things like operators, which we introduced towards the tail end of the OpenShift 3 lifecycle as well. But so, you have here, containers are wrapped in pods. Pods are, essentially the second largest kind of unit, right? Pods are configured, they're defined as a deployment. And so we have deployment configurations, that's really the desired state. And so we have, CPU and memory associated with that. We have our storage networking associated with that. And the nice thing is, you essentially are creating a golden image for what your application, what you want it to be. And so once you have that deployment kind of signed, sealed, and delivered, this is something now that you can send to other parts of your organization, especially when they want to scale up, or if they want to redeploy another version of the container. They don't have to start from scratch as far as figuring out the networking and storage side of things. They don't have to worry about what kind of compute resources do I need for all of these things. That's something that just has a blueprint all of a sudden that you can just send to other parts of your organization, or if you leave the organization, it's something that's left behind for your teams. Really, it's just to make this as automated, as simple as possible. And then other parts of that, we have services essentially, so we would call them routes. And this is a way that we actually provide load balancing or failover between different containers or different pods. And this is really how we can scale this up as well. So, every service has an IP address that's assigned to it. And so let's just, in this case, say this is some kind of, we have our front end. So maybe this is our web server. And then at the back end, we have our database or something like that. Maybe this is I always use retail, like online retail as an example, right? And so you've got your website on the front end. You've got on the back end your databases, all the different things that you need on the back end to make sure, as far as inventory is concerned, or account information, things like that. But let's say, and I'm based in the States, so let's say it's Black Friday. I think you guys probably have something similar to that, some kind of shopping holiday, right? Back in the day, you would have to spin up multiple VMs in anticipation for that, whereas something like OpenShift is able to understand with these services, what kind of traffic am I getting right now? Oh, I can go ahead and scale up immediately. I'll scale these pods up, and now I'm going from one pod on the front end and 3 pods on the back end to maybe say 5 on the front end and 15 on the back end. So, you can do this based on traffic, based on availability. If some of those pods go down, they're self-healing, so that things OpenShift will just kick right in and start to spin up more of these pods based on those deployment configurations. So it's really, really, really performance-based often, and it's something that really kind of takes the guesswork out. You don't have to anticipate what the traffic's going to be. OpenShift can do this on the fly. And then here you can just see, how these apps are communicating with each other, right? All of your applications are going to have some kind of API on the back end, and they're all able to communicate with each other within OpenShift. And you can have that isolation as well, where maybe you don't want certain pods to be able to communicate with each other. That's all up to you, right? But we make it really, really easy with this backend service to create a layer so that that communication can exist between all of these different pods.
Nice. All right, so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about like sort of the layering of where does Kubernetes stop and where does OpenShift come in?
Yeah. So we'll jump into our technical overview here, because I think I have a really good slide as far as, OpenShift is essentially, like a lot of our other products, a series of projects, right? And so, here you can see just sort of what the benefits of the container platform are, right? We're providing an optimal platform for not just provisioning and building, but also deploying your applications. And it's all supposed to be in a self-service fashion. And so, we're taking, automated workflows as far as, taking a source code and creating container images out of that. Those are going to be your golden images that you can then deploy to your registries. But really what Miles is getting towards is, where does Kubernetes fit inside of all of this, right? And so this is, I think, a good kind of breakdown of what all of the pieces are. We have our infrastructure layer here at the bottom, and we've talked about this before. That could be, a bare metal system. That could be inside of AWS or Azure or GCP. OpenStack obviously would be our preferred choice, but really what you're looking for is, on top of that, you have a secure host. So typically that's going to be RHEL in our instance, right? Mm-hmm. That's something that is enterprise grade, it's ready to deploy, and it's something that has been a part of container technology for as long as containers been around, which is for a really long time. We talked about this a little bit before, but running containers and having Kubernetes in production is more than just having a distribution of Kubernetes. You need the things like application lifecycle management. You need all of those other abstraction layers on top of Kubernetes, because if you're just running this out of box on your machine, you're going to need to create all of these other services to fill all these other parts that we've talked about before. So essentially, and I think this next slide does a really good job of this, you have your platform as a service, your containers as a service. On top of that, you have RHEL or COREOS, which is really kind of our lightweight, for containers version of RHEL. And then on top of that, you have Kubernetes. And so that really is kind of the lifeblood of OpenShift. But on top of that, we have introduced operations, which we're going to talk about just in a little bit, but essentially is a way of automating the entire life cycle. So deployment of the platform, deployment of your containers, auto healing, scaling. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a second, but you need to manage all of these different things that hook into Kubernetes. So OpenShift has the networking and integrated storage solutions built in. There's that centralized console for your developers and for your operations team, so that you can manage all of these different applications. Security is a huge part of this, right? Yeah. I mean, the security is obviously a big concern for all organizations out there right now, but security has become something that is a really integral part of the OpenShift lifecycle, right? There's the ability to to secure not just the platform, but those applications themselves that live within it. And then, you have your application services, integration with things like Service Mesh or, JBoss for middleware things. You have our cluster services. So we talked about, a private registry to manage all your images, or a chargeback if you want to provide, billing for API access to container access, centralized logging, and then obviously the developer services, implementing a CI/CD pipeline. We ship a lot of application runtimes, things like Spring Boot or Wildfire Swarm, a lot of those making the shift towards microservices. We provide all of those services as part of OpenShift as well. And so, you're really getting so much more than just an enterprise grade version of Kubernetes, right? You're getting the security and the performance, the access to the web UI, so much of these different tools that make really the entire life cycle easy to deploy and easy to manage throughout the life cycle.
Yeah. The one thing that I looked at that I thought was really interesting was how you can just start with source code and say, hey, go and build me an image out of that, instead of me having to do, find the right starting point and then go build Docker files myself.
Exactly.
That part I thought, that's perfect.
And if you're familiar with Docker files, then that's always something that you can do. But a lot of our customers are coming and they're like, we have these legacy applications. What do I have to do? I don't want to have to learn this other thing. It's like, cool. Well, you have the source code. Run this command. You now have a container image, and now you can just upload that to your registry, and anyone in your organization now has access to that container image. Yeah. It's really, really simple to use.
When I push changes in, I want a new image. It's perfect.
Yeah, and it all goes back to best practices as far as development best practices. You want to be able to push new versions of your application, be able to make sure that those are labeled really easily. It's clear what version of this application that I'm running. Anytime that you commit a change, just like with a simple git command, you're committing those changes into the registry right away. And so anyone in your organization is going to have access to those changes right away.
Nice.
So what else does OpenShift provide? I won't jump too much into this because I think that we've talked about this a lot, but auto healing of failed pods and containers is a big benefit, right? It takes the guesswork out of having to constantly monitor what's going on with these applications, right? The nice thing is, and this is something that I only encountered for the first time a few weeks ago, but I had in my OpenShift install, I had this web server that just kept going down. And the only reason I found out later on, it had been happening for like 2 months. And the only reason I didn't notice it is because OpenShift was automatically bringing the pods down and spinning them back up. And so that failover was happening pretty much instantaneously. I was never noticing that I had any downtime until I just happened to look at the logs for the first time in probably too long. You guys won't be doing that. But it was fantastic, right? There was almost no downtime as far as the user experience is concerned. We talked about service discovery, internal load balancing, right? And definitely the software-defined networking piece as well. One thing that we're going to talk about in just a second is the automated integrating security features. We introduced operators as a way of essentially being able to automate the entire life cycle, right? And so we wanted to take the guesswork out of deploying a robust cluster for the admin teams. We wanted to make it easy for developers to be able to deploy their applications and test them. So essentially all of the features that we would typically think of as having to do manually, we can essentially do now with operators. And you can even wrap operators around Ansible playbooks, things like that.
So a lot of these things that you're talking about, basically the extra stuff OpenShift does on top of Kubernetes, some of the cloud vendors, well, all the major cloud vendors have something that's doing at least part of that job. In AWS, we have EKS. Mm-hmm. In Google, we have GKE, and Azure has Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. Yeah. But I guess
PKS.
Yeah, I mean, they're doing some of those things, maybe not all those things. But what I find is that when we get into hybrid cloud, where you have some sort of physical infrastructure and you're on-prem, and then you've got the cloud, that's where we start to run into problems where using that vendor-specific version is a bit of a problem. So can you describe a little bit about how hybrid cloud works with OpenShift?
Yeah, so the biggest problem and I think this is what you're alluding to, is vendor lock-in, right?
Yeah.
If you completely tie yourself to one of these vendors, all of their tooling is going to be locked to their platform. So AKS, you're going to be locked into Azure, right? So if you want to then have some failover, so to speak, with your on-prem cloud solution or container solution, you don't really have that flexibility. And so, one thing that we really pride ourselves on is the ability to deploy OpenShift at the push of a button onto all of these other vendors. And then you get access to the tooling that is going to be compatible across all of those different vendors. So, we have a lot of customers that are obviously using Amazon. We have a huge partnership with Microsoft Azure. Being able to deploy your workloads onto and share them across Azure, Amazon, and then maybe something on-prem as well, it provides a whole lot of flexibility. And there's things that you don't want to have a different storage solution or a different monitoring solution, a different networking solution for all three of these different vendors when you can just have one that's compatible across the board. And just a couple of things here. So, this is really what the hybrid cloud is looking at. I probably should have switched this slide a second ago, but what we're making is the application portable, right? And so this is a workload that can run across. This is really what we're looking at is the vendor lock-in, right? So we have here at the bottom all of these different Kubernetes services running across all of these different clouds, and Kubernetes running on top of them. And so you're not really able to be flexible throughout. But with OpenShift, you're really able to run on top of any of these infrastructure. It doesn't matter if it's bare metal, if it's one of these cloud vendors, and still have access to all of the different features inside of this uniform environment. So like I said, a lot of these companies you see here at the bottom are typically what we would in some regards think of as major competitors, but really they're huge partners, because OpenShift is something that is going to be running on all of these workloads. The workloads will be running across all of these different cloud providers. And so, it's something that really, really is exciting for us, especially after this acquisition, because I think that the hybrid cloud is going to be the way of the future, right?
Now, I played a little bit with OpenShift 4, and I noticed that web interface is really, brings everything together in one place.
Yeah.
Can you talk about anything else new in OpenShift 4?
So for sure. So, I talked a little bit at the onset about COREOS. So we made an acquisition of COREOS about 3.5 years ago, I want to say. And it was something that was really, really exciting, because they were one of the front runners, or I should say, forefathers, so to speak, as far as moving a lot of their workloads into containerized solutions. And, this is something where we saw, if you're familiar with Atomic Host, as being sort of the future, as far as a minimal, lightweight OS that would be tough to penetrate. Obviously there's a decreased attack surface in that regard, but this is something where a lot of people didn't need the bloat of a full-blown RHEL install to run OpenShift on top of. And so, we heard what they were saying. Atomic Host wasn't meeting all of the needs that they needed. CoreOS was something that we could really start from scratch and work with what they had so much success with, and build that up to be a premier platform as far as OpenShift is concerned. And then, I've mentioned it a few times, but the automated operations really allow for not just the day one, but the day two operations for your communities, right? And so, we look at things like installation, installing either into RHEL or into CoreOS, or maybe on top of AWS or Azure, something like that. Moving into deployment, and so that's everything from your storage and networking to your private registry to all of your service management. Obviously, hardening is going to be a huge emphasis of ours. I think if you attended our webinar earlier, I talked a little bit about how for a long time Red Hat was very hands-off as far as security was concerned, and we've made a very concerted effort over the last few years to make sure that we were really pushing security as being something that we had a hand in, because we needed to make sure that not just your applications were secure, but that the platform was something that was secure as well. And then for everything after the fact, whether it's scaling your cluster, for monitoring, for upgrades, right? We wanted to make sure all of that stuff could be done automatically with these operators. And so you'll see here, this is what the new UI looks like. So you have here on the left sort of your operator console. That's where your admins are going to come in, and you can look into really lifecycle management, monitoring and metrics, And then on the right, we have our operator console. And so really our application console. And so we launched something called Operator Hub. It's with a partnership with AWS and Microsoft and with Google. And it's basically a single place that you can get these operators. Like I said before, you can create operators. There's a whole repository of them as well. And you can wrap operators around existing Ansible playbooks that you might have too. So, this is not kind of a either Ansible or our automation platform or operators, something that really work in tandem to manage every single part of the life cycle within OpenShift. And then finally, this is what our infrastructure monitoring looks like. So you have our cluster console here. So you can see the health of the cluster itself. You can see the health of all of these different applications and your workloads inside of it as well. And if you have nodes going down, CPU overusage, things like that, you'll get notifications pretty quickly. And like I said, there's auto healing that's built into the platform as well. So if you run into issues with your cluster health or anything like that, capacity planning, there's methods for OpenShift to really correct those, self-correct, and then obviously you can manually intervene if needed.
Nice. One of the things I found interesting when I earlier looked at OpenShift and trying to run that on AWS, I had to first go into AWS and provision all of the C2 instances, and then go back and do an install on there. And I saw that in OpenShift 4 now we can have the installer, take my credentials for AWS and go and provision everything for me.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of resources for taking a look at that?
100%, yeah. So let me jump out of this really quickly. So over the OpenShift team, we actually created this this video. It's a 4-minute video that's all about installing OpenShift, and we'll drop a link to this in the chat as well. But I'll just start this for a second. And so really all that this requires, this is 4 or 5 different steps. Essentially you log in, you provide your AWS credentials and your RHEL credentials, your Red Hat credentials, right? You have to have an OpenShift subscription. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, there's 3 or 4 commands that you have to type in, and then boom, the deployment is automated, right? And so this is something that we'll send over within the chat in just a second, but it's something that is so easy with AWS or with Azure or with Google to deploy OpenShift into their cloud in just a few commands, right? And it's something that's really, really becomes simple and automated. So let me, we'll drop this at the end of the session into the chat. But this is something, if you just go to YouTube and look up the OpenShift channel, it's one of our many channels. We have a lot of really great content out there. But this will walk you through. There's a demonstration on AWS, and there's one on Microsoft Azure as well.
Nice. So I guess for people who are brand new and they want to learn, initially about just containers and Kubernetes and OpenShift, or further, maybe on the administration side, understanding how to really run OpenShift, we should maybe talk about the curriculum, the Red Hat classes.
Yeah. So, obviously I come from the training and certification team. And so, we've been hard at work as far as building out curriculum for not just deployment and not just for development, for your day 2 operations as well. So this is sort of a high level bird's eye view of what our curriculum looks like. So, we have this introductory course here at the top. That's the DO 180. This is a great course to take if you're brand new to containers, right?
It really
so
is great. Yeah.
We go over everything from an overview of Docker or Podman, depending on which version you want to go into. We walk through, deploying a Kubernetes cluster, and then we kind of introduce OpenShift towards the end. So it's really a good baseline if you're not really familiar with container technology. And then really depending on what your purview is, what your job role is, we have a couple different routes that you can go. So on the administrator track, our Admin 1 course is going to cover everything from deployment of OpenShift to covering things like managing all the resources there within, right? So that's storage and networking, the monitoring and metrics services. There will be an element of troubleshooting as well. And then our Admin 2 class is all about scaling that to a highly available cluster. So, we talked about that before as far as, what kind of failover do we have between the containers? There's failover between the platform as well. And maybe that's a bare metal system. Maybe that's failover between various cloud deployments as well. And then I mentioned this a little bit, but we do have a security focused course as well, as far as securing the applications, the container themselves, and then the OpenShift platform too. On the development side,
just about the administrator track.
Sure.
Typically, people would have to be very comfortable with RHEL or with Linux in general.
Yes.
I did take most of these classes through the Red Hat Learning subscription, which is great. On our website, you can find more information about the learning subscription. So sort of a 1-year access to a number of courses.
Our entire curriculum.
Yeah, the entire curriculum. What I found was that, personally, I was a little lacking on the, Linux administration side. But would typically people have taken sort of the RHCA sort of thing?
So we would expect that you'd have the certified system administrator credential, or at least equivalent knowledge. So if you are a longtime Linux admin, you're probably going to be okay coming into the DO-180 and starting there. Really there is an expectation that you are comfortable, obviously navigating a command line, that you have storage and networking concepts from an OS level. You understand that, because a lot of what you're going to be doing is deploying from the command line. When we move into OpenShift 4, some of this will be done with operators, but there's still, a necessity to have that a sysadmin basics down pat, right? Because otherwise you can be lost in the course.
I found the DO-180 quite okay with my limited Linux administration knowledge, but getting into the OpenShift Administration 1, it was a bit of a deep dive for me personally, because I come from the developer background. Now, the developer track, it sort of assumes that you've taken the DO-180 as well, right? So you have that basics of.
Yeah, you'll definitely want to have an understanding of container technology. And so, before jumping into our developer track, the DO-180 is a good place to start. The DO-288, our Development 1 course, is all about containerizing applications. So it'll go into things like source to image builds, building applications, building container images from source code. A lot of it is going to focus on containerizing legacy applications. So that's a big focus for a lot of our customers. They're just fine with implementing OpenShift, but if they don't understand how to containerize the applications they already have in house, then what's the point, right? And then everything after that is really going to be a focus on implementing microservices. Microservices is going to be, or I should say, is really the next kind of shift in the direction of implementing quicker, right? Implementing a CI/CD pipeline, implementing DevOps. And so we have this kind of complementary course that we have. That's the JB283. It's really all just microservices theory. But our OpenShift Development 2 course is all about creating microservices with application runtimes that I mentioned before that we ship with OpenShift. And so it's a really good, if you're making that shift towards microservices, you definitely want to have an understanding of the container technology. You want to go through that Development 1 course, but the Development 2 course is all about implementing microservices. And so many people are just now making that shift from VMs into container workloads. And so, if this isn't where you're at right now in that, learning curve, definitely you may want to just stop at the DO-288. But if your company is starting to adopt microservices, if you're hearing that as kind of a buzzword, then you definitely want to look into that course as well. Now, we've mentioned the term DevOps a lot, I think, in this, and DevOps is definitely something that has a technological aspect to it, right? But what it really also has is kind of it assumes cooperation between, obviously, your developer teams, your operations teams, your administration teams, and then your business users, your management, right? And so what we've done is actually take elements of all of this curriculum, and we've created a container adoption bootcamp. And what this is really just a fast-paced, kind of think of it like a greatest hits of all of the curriculum that we just covered, and it condenses that all into 10 days. What that last slide showed is about 25 days worth of content. And again, it's siloed. It's still in that sort of waterfall approach where if you're an admin, you need to go through this route. If you're a developer, you need to go through this route. We want to make sure that organizations have the opportunity to send both of those sides of the house through all of this curriculum and understand, because it's so important that developers understand the underlying platform, that they understand what resources are being provided from my admin teams? What can I do to really get the most out of my application? And at the same time, it's important that administrators understand what the developers are really doing with these workloads. You know, they want to understand what a microservice is because they need to understand how to provision and how to tune the platform so that their applications are going to run smoothly and successfully. And so this is a really, really interesting project of ours that has I think been pretty successful so far. One really, really cool part of it is you mentioned the learning subscription. This is something that actually comes included as part of the Container Adoption Bootcamp for continued education if you're interested in becoming certified in OpenShift, whether on the admin or the development side. And then we have a lot of curriculum that we haven't covered here that's sort of your day 2 and day 3 operational things. We'll have a course coming out soon around service mesh, which is we can be tied, think if you've heard of Istio, that's service mesh. We'll have a course coming probably early next year that's going to be around just operators, developing and building operators. And so, we want to make sure that you're capable of building resilient applications. And so, once you've gone through and you understand the platform, you understand, containerizing applications, there's so much more, there's so much further that you can go. And the Container Adoption Bootcamp's a really, really interesting way of going in that route. And just to break it down again, these are the courses that will be included inside that Adoption Bootcamp. All of these courses can be consumed, on their own as well. If you are only focused on the admin side, then, go through the admin courses, right? And vice versa if you're a developer only interested in the development side. But
so this is sort of 10 days. Typically, it would be on site at a company, I would imagine.
It would. So we could bring an instructor on site to you, and then all of these other courses on their own can be consumed in various ways, right? We can bring an on-site instructor. We can you can consume them through the learning subscription or through just a one-off public classroom, something like that. So with that, I think that we are ready for some questions. Doesn't look like we have any in the Q&A. One other thing that I'll mention, as we continue to evolve with OpenShift, we'll continue to introduce more and more features. Definitely check out the OpenShift blog. If you go to blog.openshift.com, that is a Red Hat hosted blog that's got really a lot of really, really good information about the new features that we are continuing to introduce into OpenShift. Looks like we got a question. No question, but great job. Thanks. We appreciate that. Anything that you want to add, or?
No, I think I want to thank you for coming and doing these two webinars for us today. Really appreciate it. I think that we had a lot of people register for this, so they'll be getting the recorded video. And I'm sure if they have any further questions, they can send them through us. I think Michelle's probably got some information to share.
Yeah, and let me, Michelle, before you do, let me drop this. I said I would drop this into the chat real quick. Which is here. So for those of you that are interested, this is the link to that YouTube, just how to install OpenShift 4 onto AWS. Like I said, there are a lot of really interesting videos here in the OpenShift channel, so take a look at those. Things like where Kubernetes fits into the platform, or implementing a CI/CD pipeline. So hopefully we can do some more webinars on some more focused topics as well, but definitely check those out. And then again, I want to thank you, Miles, as well for having me. And if you do have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to Exit and to myself. And
we have a link there. I think that holds basically all the classes we were talking about. All the OpenShift classes fall under that DevOps category for us, as well as Ansible stuff's in there as well.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a note. We got the Red Hat Premier Training Partner of the Year.
Yes, you did.
Just a couple months ago. Yeah, that was great. So we've been putting a little more emphasis on Red Hat, and I think Michelle, you have a promotion for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, John and Miles. We are at the end of our presentation, and as a token of appreciation, we are offering 15% off of all Red Hat training with Exit Certified using the promo code RedHat0918. I will post that in the chat for everyone now. So go ahead, use that promo code, book your Red Hat training with Exit Certified and save 15%. As mentioned, we recorded this session and we're going to send all of you a copy of it. We do have a few more minutes, so if you have any questions that come up, feel free to post them in the chat. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, everyone.